John Gotti's story doesn't begin with power. It begins with hunger. Hunger to be seen, hunger to matter, hunger to escape the smallness of obscurity. Long before the suits, the cameras, the headlines, he was just another street guy in New York, surrounded by men who believed survival meant silence. The old bosses lived by one rule above all others: if people knew your name, you were already halfway dead. Gotti grew up watching that rule protect men who lived long, wealthy lives in the shadows. And he decided very early that he didn't want that kind of power. He wanted something louder. By the time John Gotti was rising through the ranks of the Gambino family, the Mafia was already aging. The structure was rigid, conservative, cautious. Bosses like Paul Castellano believed in distance, in insulation, in running things like a corporation. Castellano stayed far from the street, avoided unnecessary exposure, and treated violence as a tool of last resort. To Gotti and his crew, that felt weak. They saw themselves as real gangsters, men who earned respect face to face. The tension between those two philosophies was inevitable. One side believed power was control, the other believed power was presence. When Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in December 1985, it wasn't just a hit. It was a statement. It was loud, public, impossible to ignore. The assassination happened in front of witnesses in Midtown Manhattan during rush hour. That alone shattered decades of tradition. But what followed was even more shocking. John Gotti didn't disappear. He didn't hide. He didn't deny. He stepped forward, dressed perfectly calm, confident, and let the world figure it out. In that moment, organized crime entered a new era, whether it wanted to or not. The media fell in love instantly. Cameras tracked Gotti's movements, reporters analyzed his suits, headlines turned him into a character larger than life. He didn't resist it. He leaned into it. He smiled, waved, joked, and played the role better than anyone could have imagined. The Mafia had always feared publicity because it invited scrutiny. Gotti saw publicity as armor. As long as he was adored, as long as juries hesitated and witnesses feared becoming villains in the public eye, he believed he was safe. And for a while, he was right. Case after case collapsed. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. Prosecutors looked incompetent. The nickname the Teflon Don stuck because nothing seemed to stay on him. That name alone became a weapon. It suggested invincibility. It made people hesitate. It made rivals question whether it was even possible to bring him down. Gotti didn't just win trials, he won narratives. And in a country obsessed with stories that mattered more than brute force, but power built on narrative has a weakness. It depends on constant reinforcement. Gotti had to keep showing up, keep talking, keep being seen. Silence would have felt like retreat, so he kept performing even when he didn't need to. He talked in social clubs, in cars, in apartments, surrounded by men he trusted because they laughed with him, drank with him, called him boss. What he didn't see was that trust changes when pressure builds. Loyalty decays when fear and self-interest collide. The FBI understood this better than anyone. They didn't chase Gotti with raids and public arrests. They waited, they listened, they planted microphones in places where Gotti felt safe. And Gotti gave them everything. He complained about his underlings. He insulted allies. He discussed murders casually. He treated conversations like therapy sessions, assuming the walls were loyal too. Each word became a brick. Each tape became a thread. Slowly, invisibly, a case formed that didn't rely on chance or intimidation. It relied on time. Inside the Gambino family, the atmosphere changed. Gotti's men lived carefully while he lived boldly. They took risks while he enjoyed applause. Over time, resentment grew. Not rebellion, not yet, but fatigue. The kind of fatigue that makes people think about survival instead of honor. The Mafia preached loyalty, but loyalty had always been transactional. Protection for obedience. Silence for security. Gotti's loudness disrupted that balance. It made everyone more exposed than him. Sammy Gravano was one of the few men close enough to see the cracks clearly. He had helped Gotti rise. He had killed for him. He had enforced his authority. And then he heard the tapes. He heard Gotti blaming him, dismissing him, painting him as expendable. In that moment, the myth of brotherhood shattered. Gravano didn't flip out of hatred. He flipped out of logic. He saw where the story was going and chose to survive. When the government finally moved, it wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. The tapes played. Gravano testified. The courtroom felt different this time. No smiles, no jokes, no magic. The audience that once cheered now watched silently. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The loudest gangster in America was reduced to a number, a routine, a cell. Prison was the one place where Gotti's greatest weapon meant nothing. There were no cameras to charm, no juries to sway, no headlines to dominate. Time moved slowly and impersonally. His health declined. His influence faded. Outside, the Mafia adapted. Bosses went quiet again, but not out of tradition, out of fear. Gotti had proven that the world had changed. Surveillance was everywhere. Attention was dangerous. Silence wasn't just smart anymore. It was necessary. What makes Gotti's story endure isn't just the crime. It's the lesson hidden inside it. He didn't fail because he broke the rules. He failed because he believed he could live forever without them. His rise and fall were powered by the same engine: ego, the need to be seen, the need to be acknowledged, the belief that presence equals control, that illusion destroys more empires than violence ever could. After Gotti, organized crime never produced another public king. The spotlight became radioactive. Power returned to the shadows, weaker, quieter, less romantic. The age of the gangster celebrity ended with him, and yet his image still fascinates. The suits, the confidence, the defiance. It looks like freedom. But the ending tells the truth. He didn't lose because he lacked courage or intelligence. He lost because visibility is borrowed power, and the interest is always paid in full. John Gotti beat the Mafia by being loud at a moment when the world wasn't ready for someone like him. He died because the world learned. His life stretched across the exact moment when attention stopped being protection and became evidence. And that's why his story lasts 30 minutes, an hour, a lifetime. Because every generation produces someone who believes they can stay loud forever, and every generation eventually learns why silence always wins in the end. After the conviction, something subtle but important happened most people never noticed. The myth didn't disappear. It mutated. John Gotti stopped being a living threat and became a frozen image, locked in time. The man in the courtroom, thinner, quieter, aging, wasn't the version people remembered. What lived on was the version in the tailored suits, standing on courthouse steps, smiling like the rules didn't apply to him. That image became safer once he was gone, and that safety allowed people to romanticize him without fear. Inside prison, Gotti tried to hold on to identity because identity was all he had left. Power without visibility had always terrified him, and now he was trapped inside it. He attempted to maintain rank, to issue orders, to remind people who he was, but prison strips hierarchy down to routine. Meals, counts, lights out. The system doesn't care who you used to be. Slowly, painfully, Gotti learned the final lesson of loud power. When the noise stops, there's nothing underneath if you didn't build anything else. Outside, the Gambino family fractured. Not dramatically, not violently, but quietly. Leadership passed to men who made a point of never being photographed. Conversations shortened. Meetings moved. Trust became thinner. The families didn't vanish, but they shrank in ambition. No one wanted to be the next example. Gotti's downfall didn't kill the Mafia, it scared it into survival mode. And survival mode is boring. No legends, no kings, just cautious men trying not to be noticed. Law enforcement took its own lessons too. Gotti's case validated a strategy that reshaped crime fighting for decades. Long-term surveillance, financial pressure, insider cooperation. Let egos do the work. Instead of chasing headlines, they let criminals chase attention themselves. Gotti became a training example, cited quietly in rooms where future investigations were planned, not as a villain to fear, but as a mistake to wait for. What's haunting about Gotti's story is how modern it feels. Strip away the Mafia, the guns, the crimes, and you're left with a man addicted to attention, a man who believed visibility equaled relevance, a man who confused being watched with being in control. That mindset didn't die with him. It spread. Today, exposure is currency. Validation is power. Silence feels like failure. Gotti's life just happened earlier, louder, and with higher stakes. He believed rules were meant for weaker men. That belief carried him to the top. It also blinded him to the truth that rules often exist to protect the powerful from themselves. The old bosses weren't cowards. They were survivors. They understood that real dominance doesn't announce itself. It operates comfortably without witnesses. In the final years of his life, as illness took hold and the world outside moved on, Gotti faced something he'd avoided since the beginning: irrelevance. No crowds, no chance, no fear, just time. And time is ruthless to men who built everything on presence. When he died in 2002, it barely registered outside true crime circles. No public spectacle, no curtain call, just an ending. And that may be the most important part of the story. John Gotti didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died quietly, the exact thing he spent his life avoiding. His legend lives because people choose to remember the noise, not the silence that followed. But the silence is the truth. The silence is the cost. What makes the story feel unfinished is that John Gotti's influence didn't end with his death. It echoed outward, shaping behavior far beyond the Mafia itself. Ambition learned from him. Ego borrowed from him. People watched how quickly attention turned a criminal into a king, and how slowly that same attention tightened into a noose. But instead of rejecting the lesson, many misunderstood it. They thought the mistake was not being loud enough, or not being clever enough, or not controlling the narrative better. Few understood the real mistake was believing the narrative mattered more than reality. Gotti believed he could outpace consequences by staying one step ahead in public perception. As long as people saw him smiling, winning, untouched, he felt secure. But perception doesn't stop pressure, it delays it. While he enjoyed the moment, the system adjusted quietly. That's the part ego never sees. Power structures don't fight you at your strongest. They wait until you expose every weakness yourself. Gotti didn't lose because the government suddenly became smarter. He lost because he became predictable. There's a reason his story still feels relevant decades later. The world now rewards visibility more than ever. Being seen feels like being real. Silence feels like low. Sing. Gotti lived that belief at full volume. He treated attention like oxygen, and when it was taken away, there was nothing left to breathe. His downfall wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray it. It was slow, procedural, boring. That's how real power ends most of the time. Not with chaos, but with paperwork and time. If you look closely, Gotti's life forms a perfect arc. Hunger leads to confidence. Confidence leads to arrogance. Arrogance leads to exposure. Exposure leads to collapse. Every stage feeds the next. There's no single wrong decision you can point to and say, that's where it ended. It ended because he couldn't stop being who he was. The same trait that made him unforgettable made him unsustainable. And that's why his story doesn't belong only to crime history. It belongs to anyone chasing dominance, influence, or recognition. It's a reminder that attention amplifies everything, including flaws. The higher you rise on noise, the further you fall when silence comes. Gotti didn't just challenge the Mafia's rules. He challenged a law older than crime itself. What survives longest is what attracts the least attention. At a certain point, the story stops being about John Gotti the man and becomes about John Gotti the mirror. A mirror held up to ambition, ego, and the human need to feel important. That's why his rise feels intoxicating and his fall feels uncomfortable. He represents a version of success that looks powerful on the outside but is hollow underneath. Everything depended on momentum. As long as the noise continued, the illusion held. The moment it stopped, there was nothing left to support it. What Gotti never accepted is that power has seasons. The old bosses understood this instinctively. They didn't try to win every moment, they tried to last. Gotti tried to dominate the present so completely that he ignored the future. He treated each victory as proof that the rules were broken forever, not just temporarily bent. That mindset traps people at the peak. When you believe you've already won, you stop adapting, and the world never stops adapting. By the time Gotti realized how much had changed, it was too late. The system he once embarrassed had become quiet, efficient, and relentless. There was no enemy to confront, no rival to intimidate, no jury to charm. Just recordings, timelines, corroboration. The loudest man in the room was defeated by silence he couldn't see or fight. That's the cruelty of modern power. It doesn't announce itself. It documents you. And perhaps the most ironic part of all is this. Gotti wanted to be remembered. He feared invisibility more than prison, more than death. In that sense, he succeeded. His name still circulates. His image still fascinates. But the version of him that lasts is not the king he imagined. It's the cautionary tale he never intended to become. He isn't remembered as the man who ruled forever. He's remembered as the man who burned too bright, too fast. The men who followed learned to disappear. They learned to shorten conversations, to distrust applause, to treat attention as danger. Not because they admired Gotti's end, but because they understood its message. Loud power doesn't fade gently. It collapses suddenly. Quiet power may not look impressive, but it survives. Even decades later, the ripple effects of Gotti's choices can still be traced through the streets of New York and beyond. The Mafia learned that visibility can be fatal. Gotti's successors moved quietly, blending into communities, keeping their operations under the radar, relying on influence rather than spectacle. The era of the celebrity gangster ended with him. After Gotti, it wasn't just about earning respect, it was about surviving long enough to keep it. The world had changed, and those who understood that change thrived while the rest faded into history. But Gotti's story also influenced culture in ways he couldn't have imagined. Movies, TV shows, books, even fashion celebrated the boldness, the charisma, the defiance. People didn't necessarily celebrate his crimes. They celebrated the persona he created, the man who smiled at danger, the man who made power look effortless. That persona became larger than life, almost mythic, because it was the very thing that ultimately destroyed him. There's a lesson there for anyone chasing notoriety. The image you craft may outlive the reality you build it on, and sometimes that image is all that remains. There's also a human side to the story, often overlooked. Behind the tailored suits and the courtroom bravado was a man who feared irrelevance more than law, a man who loved his family and cared for his close associates, yet struggled to balance those personal loyalties against ambition. The dichotomy of Gotti's life, public charisma versus private vulnerability, makes it more than a crime story. It makes it a story about ego, mortality, and the relentless pressure of being seen. And finally, when we reflect on John Gotti, we see a paradox. He achieved immortality through notoriety, but he could not escape the consequences of his own choices. The lessons echo far beyond organized crime. They touch anyone who has ever chased attention, power, or recognition at the expense of patience, strategy, or subtlety. Because in the end, being loud may win the moment, but silence always has the last word. John Gotti's life is a 30-minute story of rise and fall, of charisma and consequence, of ego and inevitability. It teaches that power, when amplified for the sake of visibility, carries a cost that can't be avoided. He beat the Mafia in public, but silence and time ultimately claimed him. His legend lives on, not as proof of invincibility, but as a timeless reminder that in the game of power, it is often those who move quietly who survive the longest. Even after Gotti's death, the fascination with him refuses to fade. People are drawn not just to the crimes, but to the audacity, the confidence, the swagger, the ability to turn fear into spectacle. His life is studied, analyzed, and mythologized because it exposes a fundamental truth about human ambition. Visibility can feel like security, but it is a fragile armor. Gotti's story reminds us that the louder you make yourself, the more everyone notices your vulnerabilities. Every smile, every wave, every tailored suit became a signal, and the system noticed every one of them. But beyond the headlines and media spectacle, there is a deeper lesson. Gotti's rise and fall illustrate the delicate balance between perception and reality. When he was at the peak, it seemed like charisma alone could protect him. Witnesses feared testifying. Law enforcement seemed powerless. But reality has a way of catching up, slowly and relentlessly. The microphones, the informants, the recordings, they didn't care about charm or confidence, they cared about truth. And truth has patience. His story also serves as a mirror to society's obsession with fame and notoriety. John Gotti became larger than life because people wanted to see a king in the streets, someone who could command attention and bend rules. But that same obsession with being seen, being recognized, and being feared is what led to his downfall. In the end, Gotti's greatest weapon, visibility, became the instrument of his undoing. And yet, the legacy persists. From documentaries to films to books, the narrative of Gotti's life continues to captivate. The lesson is timeless. Power that relies solely on spectacle is fleeting, but influence built quietly, patiently, and strategically endures. The era of the loud public gangster ended with Gotti, but his story remains as a cautionary tale and a fascination, a 30-minute or 30-hour lesson on ambition, ego, and the consequences of being too visible in a world that rewards the unseen. In the final analysis, John Gotti beat the Mafia by breaking the rules, by being bold, by being impossible ignore. But he died because the rules of life, of consequence, and of survival are not broken by charm or courage. They are only postponed. And that is the story that lives on, a man who was unstoppable in the spotlight, yet ultimately claimed by the quiet, patient power of time. In the end, John Gotti's life is a study in contrasts, a man who rose to unimaginable power through charisma, audacity, and sheer force of presence, yet fell because the very traits that made him legendary also made him vulnerable. He taught the world that being loud can command attention, inspire fear, and even bend rules, but he also proved that no amount of bravado can outlast time, law, and consequence. Gotti's story isn't just about the Mafia, crime, or headlines. It's about the cost of ego, the fragility of fame, and the delicate balance between visibility and survival. His legend lives on because people remember the spectacle, the power, and the defiance. But the real lesson endures quietly. True, lasting power is earned in silence, strategy, and patience, not in applause, flash, or the fleeting glow of notoriety.